Our gospel reading today is from John, chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Canaan in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach. But the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to them, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your arms, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple who Jesus loved and followed them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper, and he said, "Lord, who is that is going to betray you?" The word of God for the people of God. Amen. How many times in our lives do we torture ourselves with the belief that what we have done in life makes us unfit to be loved by God? How many times do we search for ways to make ourselves worthy of God's love? Well, if you've ever felt this way, you know that you're in really good company. Martin Luther used to torture himself with these words. Have I done enough? Over and over, so much so that the abbot in his monastery feared that Luther was going to lose his mind and physically harm himself. The story is told that Luther would enter the confessional, confess his sins, perform the penance assigned to him, and then before he even left the church, he would return to the confessional to confess again, because he feared so that his had sinned some way and that God was angry again with him. Can you imagine going through life that way? Always fearful? Always believing that God's angry at you? I want you to think about Simon Peter today. And I want you to think about him specifically in the context of today's gospel lesson. You see, this particular lesson concerning the amazing catch of fish is not unique to John's gospel. We also find it in Luke's gospel. But the timing there is different. And that is really important to take note of. In Luke's gospel, it occurs very early in Jesus' ministry, just when he is first calling his disciples. And in Luke's gospel, we have Peter, after seeing the amazing catch, falling at Jesus' knees and saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Peter's response to Jesus in Luke is important and meaningful in the context of Luke's gospel. Peter understands his relationship to God under the law. He has not yet come to understand his relationship to God as a result of the gospel. But Peter's declaration, a different agenda, if you will, for the placement of the story and the lesson it teaches because of where John places it, is incredibly important for us to hear and to understand. Unlike in Luke's gospel, the story in John's gospel comes at the very end, after Jesus' resurrection. So it comes after Peter's denial on the night before Jesus' crucifixion. All right, now let's put ourselves in Peter's sandals. You have denied even knowing Jesus. And that is despite having previously declared that you would die for him. How do you imagine you're probably feeling at this point? Now remember, at this point in John's gospel, Jesus has appeared to the disciples 2 other times. The first was in the upper room on Easter evening. The second time was again in the upper room 8 days later. This appearance at the Sea of Tiberias, which is the Sea of Galilee, is the third time Jesus has appeared to the disciples. But take note of something. In each of those previous appearances, Peter is not mentioned. It is almost if the gospel writer was marginalizing Peter. Or is it possible that Peter has marginalized himself because of his denial? There's no doubt that Peter believes Jesus has resurrected. We are told as much in the Easter gospel. But Peter is carrying a lot of baggage. He's denied knowing Jesus. His denial is as much a betrayal as were the actions of Judas. The difference is that Peter has not killed himself physically. However, he's killing himself spiritually. I can feel that Peter is despondent. He may be despairing of ever being worthy of Jesus' love again. This proud and impulsive man seems to have placed himself on the periphery. John's recounting seems to indicate that Peter does not want to be too visible, does not want to be seen by Jesus. But now, notice how Peter acts in today's lesson. The impulsiveness is returned. But first of all, you have to understand what is not being said directly in today's gospel. At the beginning of the lesson, we are told that the disciples are still gathered together. But they're no longer in Jerusalem. They are now at the Sea of Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. What we do know is how long it has been since Jesus. What we do not know is how long it has been since Jesus last appeared to them in Jerusalem. But it must have been a great time, because the Sea of Galilee is 70 miles from Jerusalem. And they had to walk through incredibly rough terrain and are now gathered there, perhaps at Capernaum. Then out of nowhere, Peter announces he is going fishing. And lacking anything better to do, the other disciples agree to go with him. So off they go in the boat onto the lake. They spend all night fishing, and they catch nothing until a stranger instructs them to put their net to the right side of the boat. Immediately, they make a huge catch of fish, too many for them to haul in. One disciple, in conventional wisdom, would indicate that there was John, now recognizes Jesus and announces as much to the others. Once again, Peter's impulsiveness kicks in and he swims to shore. It's to be near Jesus, at least physically. Now, this is where it gets interesting. And it's interesting because of what the events around that little charcoal fire mean for all of us. And I think it's interesting that it takes place during a meal. Consider the meal for a moment. It's a simple meal. Fish and bread. Breakfast. People gathered around a meal as family, as friends. When there are problems that need to be solved, gathering for a meal is a great way to solve those problems. It's difficult to be angry with someone when you're breaking bread with them. And I think that is the stage that Jesus is setting here. He knows how upset these men are, particularly Peter. Think about it. With the exception of John, all of them deserted him in his agony. With the exception of John, where were they when he died so horribly on that cross? They were hiding. Every single one of them, except for John. And Peter had denied him, had told 3 people that he did not even know Jesus. Today, we might say there was a huge elephant in the room, and no one wanted to admit it was there. There was a lot that needed to be said, but it was not being said. So they were around the fire, eating. John doesn't record any of the conversation, if there was any. Can you imagine the awkward silence, sitting around eating, not talking? Probably not as hard for men to do, but if women were there, it would even be more so. It is Jesus that breaks the silence, and he breaks it with Peter. Jesus asks, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Peter says to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I have affection for you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Jesus said to Peter again a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I have affection for you." Jesus said, "Tend my sheep." Jesus said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you have affection for me?" Peter was grieved because he asked him a third time. "Do you have affection for me?" He said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I have affection for you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." When you read this passage, are you confused by Jesus asking the question 3 times? Why does Jesus need to ask the question 3 times? It's because Jesus is reaching out to Peter in a way that is not immediately clear to Peter or to us. You see, the first and second time Jesus asks, he uses the Greek word agapos, which is one way of saying love. The third time, Jesus asked the question. He uses the Greek word philios, which is another way of saying love. But there's a difference in the quality of love implied by each of these words. The first two times Jesus asked the questions, he is asking Peter if he loves him enough to die for him. Peter, do you love me enough to die for me? That is what agape implies. It is the kind of love Peter professed for Jesus early on Thursday night, but could not live up to it after Jesus was arrested. Jesus is actually revisiting Peter's inability to live up to his own words. The third time Jesus asks his question, he's asking Peter if he loves him in a brotherly way, a human way. Peter, do you love me like a brother? This is what philios implies. Jesus is giving Peter grace. Peter knows he could not live up to what Jesus had asked of him. He could not do it the night before Jesus' death on the cross, and he had no reason to believe he could do it now. So Jesus comes down to Peter's level and lowers the expectation. Then Jesus does something else. He tells Peter that he, Peter, will eventually be able to agape, to love Jesus enough to die for him. It will happen when Peter grows old. Jesus is foretelling Peter's death on his own cross. And finally, he welcomes Peter back. Jesus says to Peter, "Follow me." Jesus does the same for each of us every day of our lives. Just as Martin Luther asked, "Have I done enough?" So too do we ask, "Have I done enough?" Because we know we are incapable of that type of love that Jesus asks of us. And Jesus knows it too. So Jesus comes down to us. He lowers the bar for us. He says to us, "I will always love you enough to die for you. And I accept the fact that you are not always able to love me in that way. But it's okay. Just follow me and love me as you are able." That's the lesson we can learn from today's gospel. We can never love God in a way that will equal God's love for us. But that does not stop God from loving us so much that he sacrificed his only Son for us and for our salvation. Amen. Please join in the Apostles' Creed and